whenever you talk about Marxism, a lot of people are going to roll their eyes because they're going to say, oh, I'm not a Marxist. I'm not teaching economic theories of Karl Marx. So why would you call me a Marxist? Or why would you say that what I'm doing is Marxism? And what I tried to do in the book is help people understand that Marxism started, well, it actually didn't even start with Karl Marx. Karl Marx kind of synthesized and systematized a bunch of existing things. And then from Marx, it branched out like a tree into political movements and ideological movements that we see today. But it's all part of the same tree. There's no question about it.
Well, I guess the first thing is to tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Dan Ellsworth. I'm a consultant and a writer. I live in Virginia, so I'm pretty far from kind of the Utah area of the church. And I kind of like it that way, to be honest.
Well, cool. Well, you wrote this book, and I have it here. I'll put it up here on the screen for everybody to see. It's Marxism, a Latter-day Saint Perspective. Now, I notice in the background, there's a tree, and
Yes.
that tree doesn't look very healthy. Is there some symbolism in that, Dan? I think there is.
There is symbolism in that, because when we think of the gospel, if we were to talk about gospel imagery, in the restored gospel, the tree of life is an image that comes to mind. It's this beautiful, radiant tree that brings love and joy to people. And so here we have a tree that's kind of the opposite. It's a dead tree, and it doesn't bring love and joy to people. But I also, in the book, I use the tree as sort of a metaphor for understanding Marxism. Whenever you talk about Marxism, a lot of people are going to roll their eyes because they're going to say, oh, I'm not a Marxist. I'm not teaching economic theories of Karl Marx. So why would you call me a Marxist? Or why would you say that what I'm doing is Marxism? And what I tried to do in the book is help people understand that Marxism started, well, it actually didn't even start with Karl Marx. Karl Marx kind of synthesized and systematized a bunch of existing things. And then from Marx, it branched out like a tree into political movements and ideological movements that we see today. But it's all part of the same tree. There's no question about it.
I see. So, and that's kind of my, I'm thinking I'll play a little devil's advocate here, because one of the things that people bring up is they're going to look at this and be like, oh my gosh, Marxism, here goes our right-wing talking point, Ezra Taft Benson, everything is Marxism,
Yeah.
And that's sort of what people are going to think. And maybe what would you say to people who maybe see just the book, the cover, and that's their thought is, oh great, here we go on another one of these, everything is Marxism rants.
Yeah. So honestly, that is a valid concern. We sometimes talk about semantic inflation, where you take a term and you just expand the definition to where it no longer even means anything.
Mm-hmm.
People do that for the word racism. People do that for the word fascism. Any conservative belief is fascism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And semantic inflation is a problem. And so that's why in the book, I tried to help people understand why, for example, queer theory is Marxist. And how did I do that? Well, I quoted one of the founders of queer theory, Judith Butler, giving a speech to a group of Marxists and saying, my project is every bit as aligned with Marx's views and his objectives as yours is. She was claiming Marxism. She quoted Marx at these people. So that's what I tried to do, is help people understand, when we say that queer theory is Marxist or critical race theory is Marxist, I wanted people to see, practitioners of these ideologies claiming Marxism, because that's why we claim that those are Marxist ideologies.
Yeah, and I guess let's step back even one step before that, because we're talking Marxism all over the place. What the heck are we talking about here? What is, if you have to summarize Marxism, how do you summarize it?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because there are people who, that's a big fight that you walk into when you ask that question, because Marxists have been having that fight ever since the death of Karl Marx, right? Marxist thinkers have developed different branches of Marxism, and you have kind of these Marxists who consider themselves to be sort of originalist Marxists or classical Marxists or orthodox Marxists, who say, we are just trying to promote the vision of the world that Karl Marx promoted, and it's centered around economic concerns and what we call materialism, the idea that somebody's well-being is determined by their material situation in society, right? So you have those Marxists. Sorry, I mispronounced that. You have those Marxists who are kind of, they consider themselves sort of the originalists, but then you have a lot of other Marxists who say, Marx, his concerns were not just on economics. Marx talked about religion. Marx talked about the family. Marx talked about, he had much broader interests than just economics.
So in the book, and I think that this is kind of what you're getting at here, you had said that in the book, the way you're kind of defining Marxism and the way that we're talking about it in this conversation and in the book is the general ideas of Karl Marx, his sort of worldview and vision of the way that the world works. Is that kind of the way that you would say it?
Yeah. How did Marx view the world? And what was his worldview? And what were his assumptions about reality? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are Marxism. What
I see.
Marx thought is Marxism.
I see. Now, how would you, so if we're going to sum up and try and steel man sort of, what is, if you have to put some of the fundamentals of the Marxist worldview, of the way that Karl Marx viewed the world, what does that look like? What sort of a steel man of his vision of the world?
Wow, that's another good question. Well, so Marx had some very fundamental assumptions. One of them is the socialist assumption that governments and states can actually allocate resources better than individuals in free markets, right? That's basically the core of socialism. Now, there is another assumption, and that is that the world is divided into oppressed and oppressors. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
you are either an oppressor or you are oppressed.
Okay.
And so Marx viewed the world in that way. Marx had kind of a formula for understanding the way that the world works, and he outlined it in his book Capital. Well, no, actually, I'd go back to the Communist Manifesto, where he said the whole goal of communism is the abolition of private property,
Okay.
right? So the idea was you have these people who hold access to something that other people cannot access. And it was capital, it was private property, right?
Uh-huh.
And they are part of a superstructure, which is kind of a top layer of society that governs the bottom layer, which
I
is
see.
ordinary people working, interacting, and doing things. So that is sort of the Marxist formula. There are
And
more
that's,
elements to it, but that's
and that
basically it.
definitely, so it's funny because as I was reading the book, one of the things that I got out of it and that I myself have also found is that when we talk about Marxism, people immediately think about economics.
Yeah.
Right. That's, and it's fun. And that was Karl Marx's sort of thrust.
Yeah.
But and I think you point this out in the book very well. And I think it's fair to say is that was an application of an underlying deeper ideology.
Yes.
So communism, the way I think of it, was how do we apply the Marxist ideology into the real world?
Yeah.
But communism isn't Marxism in a sense. You can actually differentiate the two,
Yes.
because communism was sort of the plan, but it wasn't the more fundamental ideology from whence that plan sprang. Is that fair to say?
Correct. That's exactly right. Communism and Marxism are not the same thing. And when you say they are the same thing, you make a lot of people angry. You make queer theorists angry. You make critical race theorists angry. All of these other people who claim Marxism get angry. They say, no, we are just as Marxist as any communist, right?
And I find, though, that a lot of people push back. What do you say to those who say, look, I'm for critical race theory, I'm for queer theory, and they won't even say those technical terms. They'll just say, like, I'm for redistributing, reparations, and I'm for quotas in affirmative action plans and things like that, and all that. But I'm not a Marxist. I mean, come on here.
Right. And a lot of people are kind of ashamed to own that term for their belief system, and there's good reasons for that. Marxism has been responsible for just probably the most bloodshed and horror and terror of any ideology that we've ever seen in history.
Including Nazism?
Oh yeah, by far. I mean, Nazis, like, they had nothing on Marxism. Marxist governments, I mean, if you want to take, like, per capita devastation, the Khmer Rouge wiped out probably more than a quarter of the population of Cambodia.
It's insane.
Yeah, it's unfathomable. Imagine a country losing a quarter of its population as a result of an ideology. And obviously Mao Zedong, some people estimate that he's responsible for more than 60 million people dead. Joseph Stalin, a lot of these people, like, their numbers in terms of the horrors that they inflicted on humanity, it's astounding.
So, to a critic who's listening, who's going, all right, but this is we're Latter-day Saints. It's a Latter-day Saint perspective. This is a political thing, right? There's a lot of politics involved here. This is a social and economic theory that you learn in social studies class. In some sociology class, you'll learn about Marx and his theories about the world. But this isn't, like, we're Latter-day Saints. What does this have to do with our religion?
So that's interesting. I mean, I wrote this book to be explicitly apolitical. Like, I am not advocating for a political party. I'm not advocating for a political worldview of any kind. I just want to talk about Marxism in a Latter-day Saint context. Like, what principles of the gospel are challenged by Marxism, and then also say, okay, in areas where I say that Marxism is opposed to the restored gospel, well, then what is the right answer? Like, what is a good way of approaching activism, for example, if not Marxism? Because there are good, Brigham Young said that evil is inverted good. Well, then what is the good that has been inverted, right?
So, and as I read the book, here's one of the things that surprised me for anyone who's thinking about the book. I was surprised at the level of sort of empathy and compassion that you take towards the Marxist. You didn't approach them as, these people are the vilest and evilest people among us that we need to destroy and root out.
Right.
You had a different perspective on them,
Right.
saying that that their motives were actually largely good.
Yeah.
And that people become Marxist not because they're bad people. They become Marxist because they're good people.
Yeah.
And so talk a little bit more about that, like, about people that go down into this ideology. Like, what do you think is motivating them?
So there's a book that I quote in my book, and it's called Wild Swans: Three Daughters of China. And I just cannot recommend that book enough. And It's a story of generations of Chinese women and what happened when Mao Zedong took over China. What happened in these Chinese families. And you can see, like the author, her parents were part of the revolution. Like they were just absolutely dedicated to it. They were diehards. And then they end up being tortured and imprisoned and harassed by that same revolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have these stories of people who were part of Mao's revolution, for example, who thought they were doing something good. They said our society's not fair. Here's a movement that promises fairness. And they really honestly thought they were making the world a better place. Good-hearted people. And then, like, once they actually are doing this and they the revolution succeeds in overthrowing the previous regime and stuff, then they start seeing, wait a minute, something's really wrong. We've produced an authoritarian, right? Mao Zedong is in power and he's this nightmare of a human being. How did that happen? It's not what they were promised. And I think throughout history, vast numbers of Marxist activists have been in that situation where they thought they were doing something good and were absolutely blindsided by what emerged, right?
Yeah, I mean, think about. I even think in Karl Marx's story, and you go over it so well in the book, is there's sort of this idea of we have an unfair world. It's
Yeah.
in a way, as I look at it, it's almost like they're responding to the fallen nature of the world.
Yeah.
They're saying, look, things are not fair. People are disadvantaged. And what if we create a society that works together to solve that problem?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, that doesn't sound like a bad thing.
Right. Right.
That's a really good thing. And so the way I see it, it's sort of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, to kind of steelman Marxism, as you kind of explained it, there's sort of, we look out at the world and we see inequities, we see unfairness, we see, things that we want to correct. And Marx's ideology is that these inequities are caused by systems of power that are, in his obviously was focused on the economic systems of power, the means of production, things like that. But the underlying ideology is kind of at its roots is saying there are systems of power, and these systems of power produce disparate outcomes and advantage some groups and disadvantage other groups.
Yeah.
And so we need to essentially get control of these systems of power in order to control them and alter them in such a way that they produce equity and fairness for all.
Right.
And on sort of a broad level, like this all, how does that lead to hundreds of millions of people dead? That sounds like, it sounds to me like this is something really good. Shouldn't this be the goal of society? Where's the disconnect here?
Right. And I'm glad you've said all this, because I think you can see why a Marxist message appeals to people, why it has throughout history. It's not like, Mao Zedong wanders into a village and the village is all monsters and so they follow him. No, I mean, there's this message of, hey, society can be more fair. We have a plan to do it. Nobody else does. Oh gosh, you can actually really have empathy for just kind of that impulse of wanting to make the world a better place and being, just seeing the amount of hurt in the world and how unfair it is sometimes. You can see why people gravitate toward this. And so I tried to show that in the book. I always hope that, people read that book and they'll say, okay, I can see the logic of it, why somebody would have been seduced by this ideology, right?
Well, and there's a lot of ex-Mormons now. And one of the things that they do is they move leftward in their politics, right? And I would, just to kind of, I guess, frame this as I talk about left and right, left is just a description of a move away from the status quo, right? Right is a tendency to want to basically react against the pull away from the status quo and be more cautious about our changes in the future. And so the leftward pull in our current sort of sociopolitical context is towards Marxist ideology.
Yes,
It's
it
towards,
is.
we need more radical rejiggering of the systems of power
Yes.
in order to produce the fair society, where a conservative says, hold up here a little bit. Like, I think we need to be very cautious, and maybe we don't need to change those things. And it's more of an opposition to it. Something that Thomas Sowell talks a lot about. But to understand this sort of Marxist impulse, a lot of ex-Mormons move towards that space.
Yes.
They move leftward in their politics. Why, I guess, how does this stuff that we're talking about apply to that sort of group of ex-Mormons that tend to move leftward?
So Marxism has different flavors, right? And there is a Maoist flavor of Marxism. And it's that which Mao Zedong in China, he kind of implemented his own flavor of Marxism. And in the Cultural Revolution in China, he taught this principle called the four olds, old culture. He was trying to get people to get rid of the past, like eliminate the past from their lives. And what ended up happening was he planted in people's hearts and minds this thing that you call an external locus of control in psychology. And in psychology, when they talk about the external locus of control, the basic idea is I cannot be happy as long as powerful others exist, or, like powerful institutions, they determine my happiness. Powerful other people, powerful old ideas, like Mao Zedong taught. Okay, so the opposite of an external locus of control is an internal locus of control, where you say, okay, I wake up in the morning, I can make my life better. Whatever else is going on in the world, I can be okay. I can do this, right? And so when you condition somebody for an external locus of control, that is regarded by psychologists as a measure of mental health. You're actually making them mentally ill, okay? So Mao Zedong,
you're saying it makes them mentally ill when they start to move their locus of control out of themselves to where their well-being is determined by the social factors, right? It's like and it's funny because I'm listening to this going, I can see this on both the right and the left, because there's sort of on the right side, it's sort of like the globalist elites, like, I remember I met somebody on my mission, and this is maybe a little bit of a side tangent, but it relates to this. She's this little old lady, and I was on my mission during the Iraq War, and I went and knocked on her door, and she was, I could see she was really upset. We were talking to her. She's like, there's so many problems in the world, and there's a war in Iraq, and I could see it, like she was very upset. Like her day was like being ruined. And I couldn't help be like, lady, you're like a 7-year-old lady living in Argentina. Like, why are you allowing this stuff, this external locus of things in the world, destroy your life that you have? You have no control over these things. So you're saying that when people do that, psychologically, it's really bad for you to spend your entire life looking at everything around you instead of saying, hey, how do I respond?
Yeah. So imagine if we went to church and the church implemented a curriculum centered around the Missouri persecutions. And that's all we talked about.
Had that at a time. Just
well, imagine that's like all we talked about. And we would go to church and rehearse those grievances and rehearse it and rehearse it. And we would feel validated and feel this pain and this empathy for the suffering of our people way back when. And it would mess us up so badly. We would feel empathy for the sufferings of the past and stuff like that. But we would become unfree. We would not be free. We would be just consumed by this narrative of grievance. And the narrative might even be true, but we would not be free.
See, and that's the tricky part with this, because there's a side to which I go, yeah, but there are real injustices that mess up people's lives.
Right.
So where is that line between an overemphasis and an underemphasis to where we're just, I guess as Karl Marx would say, just taking the opium of the masses that lulls us into a rebellion against things that should be rebelled against in the social systems.
Well, and that's why you can see in the book, I quote several people around Marx who were very hostile toward Christianity. Because if you look at the example of Christ, if Christ had an external locus of control, he would be teaching his followers to obsess about Rome. You can't be happy because Rome is in charge. You cannot be happy. You cannot enjoy life as long as Rome is running the show here, as long as we're a vassal state to Rome. And that would cultivate an external locus of control, and his followers would have been miserable. He never did that. Rome was just this afterthought, like, hey, we've got things to do. We're going to go heal people. We're going to go do amazing things every single day. That was Christ's internal locus of control. Yeah, we're under this oppressive system, but let's go out today and do amazing things together.
Well, and it's funny because the kind of ultimate anti-Marxist Latter-day Saint leader, Ezra Taft Benson, his most famous quote that I always quote all the time is exactly on that topic. It says that the world works from the outside in, but the Lord works from the inside out.
Right.
And he changes us, and then we go change the world. But the focus of changing the world, it starts with you and getting yourself right. And so I guess it's sort of like the old 80-20 rule. A Marxist puts 80% or more, for the real extreme ones, of their focus outside of themselves, where a Christian, it's not that they don't care about the outside world. It's just that it's flipped to say, look, the most important work that you do is the work in your own soul and in your own home. Don't go out trying to, and this is a Jordan Peterson sort of thing you hear him saying all the time, is sort of like, I think it diagnoses that as a problem in our society today, where people are so focused on these external things and their room isn't clean.
Right. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. So Mao Zedong, he used to gather people into assembly areas in China where they would rehearse their grievances. And then that led to going out into the world and beating people and torturing them and harassing them. And that was the Cultural Revolution. It's estimated like maybe up to 2 million people died just in that whole thing alone. When we talk about struggle sessions where somebody has sinned in some way, and you just harass them and you just get a mob to harass them. Like, you have these pictures of people, of these crowds of people in China doing this. The struggle session emerged under Mao. And it was because, okay, this person believes in capitalism, and therefore we need to humiliate and torture them. Otherwise, we can't be okay having this person who believes in capitalism, right? Whereas with Christianity, it's like, okay, yeah, there's a lot of bad things going on, but I'm not going to, like, my happiness doesn't depend on all these other things.
Even wilder and more radical than that, it's like, you're to love the people that are your enemies. Like, that's weird to desire. And that doesn't mean that you like all the things that they do, obviously, but there's a sense in which you, as a Christian, say, my response to those who are my enemies is to desire their good, to desire their flourishing through the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Whereas a Marxist ideology, because it is systems of power at work, and it's a atheistic philosophy, which doesn't view a power higher than man. It says, if the power is messed up, the power to fix it is the power of man. Whereas in Christianity, we say there is a power that undergirds all of mankind through a sort of spiritual nature that we have, and that can be transformed through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so the ultimate power isn't my violent revolution.
Right.
The ultimate power is the power of the cross and our Savior and his Spirit.
Right. Correct. So, going back to the issue of ex-Mormon communities, for example, they have adopted that Marxist formula, the external locus of control. I can't be happy as long as the church exists the way it does. I can't be happy. And they obsess over it. They obsess. It's very Maoist, right? It's a Maoist culture. And Mao Zedong, he used to, did you ever see in the late 1990s, there was a movie called The Sixth Sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Scared
you
the
know,
crap out of me.
right. It was one of the scariest movies ever. I'm bringing it up in Halloween season. One of the most horrifying moments in the movie is toward the end when you have this situation where a mother had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where she had been actually poisoning her daughter over time. So that's a thing where you keep someone sick so that you can be praised for being the hero for helping them, right? It's a diagnosed condition, a psychological condition where I'm going to keep this person or this group of people sick and then allow myself to be viewed as the hero as I validate their pain, as I, you know, bring solutions to their pain, or band-aid solutions, I should say. That is the Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And Mao Zedong did that to his people. I'm just going to be really blunt and say that Munchausen syndrome by proxy is very common in ex-Mormon spaces, right? You have these figures who keep people sick. I'm just going to feed them this external locus of control. I'm going to do the opposite of cognitive behavior therapy, right? We call it reverse CBT, where you're actually like teaching people the cognitive distortions, where their mental health just deteriorates. And then you get to be the hero. Well, that's a very Marxist formula, right? That's what Mao Zedong did. I should say it's a Maoist formula.
Yeah,
that was his formula. That's what he did for China.
And it emerges from the further underlying way of viewing the world of systems of power control you. And I remember one of the more interesting conversations I've ever had on this topic. I'm a huge fan of, I know that you worked with him in the book. What is his name?
Jonathan
one of the biggest,
Haidt?
No, not Jonathan Haidt. He went on a Quick Show and actually talked about it.
Oh, James Lindsay?
James Lindsay. And one of the things that he and Greg were talking about is this idea of, within Marxism, when you get down to the roots of sort of the ideologies, there's that philosophical question of what makes man. And the Marxist answer, this materialistic atheist, is that man makes man. The social systems, and for Marx himself, Marx, the man, was very focused on the economics. So he was saying the financial systems make man.
Yeah.
And so when you think that it's all man-made, it's all, as we would say nowadays, social constructs.
Yeah.
Then you start to say, well, then the only way you can fix the world is to fix the systems of power. And for an ex-Mormon that views the church as a system of power that manipulates and does harm to people, and you could even use Marxist language, creates alienation between their authentic self.
Yep.
They then say, we have to fix this. And that's why they, in a way, it's a psychological thing of like, they can't be happy until they fix the injustices in the world. And they're going to create these struggle sessions and all the stuff that they come out remarkably, as you're saying, Maoist.
Yeah.
Because of this underlying worldview that says that man makes man. Whereas for a Christian, we have a different worldview.
Right.
And we say that mankind can be anything. For us, for Latter-day Saints, we can be gods.
Yeah.
And so you have your agency, and what makes you is you and how you decide to respond to the world.
Yeah.
And that's an important distinction. And in the book, I know that you get into all of these sorts of things in much deeper levels, but I wanted to just say that was something that, again, when you understand that, man, it makes it makes sense of a lot of this.
Yeah. So contrast, for example, the Maoist revolution in China with the American Revolution. The American Revolution was very drenched in Christianity, right? And so it wasn't about this like permanent hatred and loathing of the British. Yeah, we went to war, and then over time, like we actually went to war again against the British, but they were not our external locus of control. Like they weren't the powerful others. You know, we're not haunted by the idea of the British to this day, right? Whereas with the Maoist revolution, they were obsessed with these enemies forever, like forever. There's no letting go of any grievances. There's no grace. There's no forgiveness. There's no reconciliation at all. And it's a very, very stark contrast.
And I think that, and I want to, when we get to the end of this interview, I think one of the big things that I've got from your book, as I was reflecting on it, is this difference between control and liberty. And I think you can see it in the American Revolution versus the Maoist Revolution. One was about control. Systems of power create the world, therefore we must control the systems of power.
Yeah.
The American Revolution says systems of power are the problem. Let's make people free. And the great American experiment is, what will they do if we make them free?
Correct.
And that is sort of the at the heart of this. And it's a difference between sort of, again, agency and liberty, which is not an end in and of itself, I say. It's the preconditions to the good life. It isn't the good life just to be free.
Right.
You have to use that freedom well. But there are those who say, well, to make the good life, I just need to grab the systems of power and control it. And I think that's a difference in sort of the Marxist mindset versus the Christian mindset. Would you say that's fair?
I would say that's absolutely accurate.
There's
an obsession with power that emerges, and Marxism, it promises this ideal society, and yet everywhere it's implemented, it creates authoritarianism. That's the product of Marxism. Now, as Latter-day Saints, as temple-going Latter-day Saints, think of that word tyrant. You know, Marxism is a system for producing tyrants. That is the outcome everywhere it is done. It's like a tyrant factory.
Because you need to control the systems of power.
Yeah.
You need someone to control the systems of power.
Right. And so these monsters rise to the top in Marxist societies. I mean, they are just ruthless tyrants. And so, but that is what happens when your worldview is centered around power. And I show in the book that emerges from Karl Marx himself. He was totally obsessed with power.
Well, and it makes sense if there is, again, that fundamental assumption at the roots of the ideology that man makes man through the systems of power that we create. And now, to shift a little bit here, there are those that will look at it and say, well, hold on here a second. Hold on. Remember, the goal here of this sort of Marxist worldview is to fix unfairness, to create equity, these sound like Christian ideals. In fact, it was the Christians who were the ones who had all things in common among them. Zion as a society. It's the society where it all is everyone sharing with one another. It's sort of I'm looking at basically the same end product here. And so there are those that would say, why are you Christians all criticizing this sort of economic equity when that is exactly what Christianity prescribes as sort of this united order, as we would call it, as Latter-day Saints, or whatever it was in the New Testament church that existed, where all things were held in common and people just sort of took care of one another. What do you say to those that level that sort of a critique against, that say that they aren't that different?
So Marxism tries to achieve that, which is a good thing. You know, that Zion society that's described in scripture sounds amazing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Marxism tries to achieve that by removing people's inner freedom Remember, we talk about the locus of control, remove their inner freedom, and then remove their external freedoms. All right. All their physical freedoms and their freedoms of association and everything. Christianity has the exact opposite approach. Make people free deep in their soul, free from covetousness and lust and all of these other things. That is freedom. That's like the real deep freedom of Christianity, is to not be, envious and jealous and covetous and in that kind of a mindset. To not be obsessed with power is inner freedom, right? That is what Christianity offers. And so those people who are free inside, can create a Zion society. And it requires no coercion at all. They don't have to be, it doesn't have to happen by force. Okay. Whereas communism, just because it starts with the opposite assumption that unfreedom is what is needed, it all has to be coerced. It all has to be done by force. And it's never successful either.
Yeah. And it's funny because there are those who think that this is some sort of a kind of a right-wing talking point, or it's all political, without really understanding the way that, because communism was such a direct threat to the world order, kind of historically, our leaders were more maybe vocal about their denunciation of these things. And one of them that I found, let me see if I can find it here. He said, what is the real cause of this trend toward the welfare state, towards more socialism? In the last analysis, in my judgment, it is personal unrighteousness. When people do not use their freedoms responsibly and righteously, they will gradually lose those freedoms. If man will not recognize the inequalities around him and voluntarily, through the gospel plan, come to the aid of his brother, he will find that through a, quote, democratic process, air quotes, he will be forced to come to the aid of his brother. The government will take from the haves and give to the have-nots. Both have lost their freedom. Those who have lost their freedom to give voluntarily, of their own free will and in the way they desire. And those who have not have lost their freedom because they did not earn what they received. They got something for nothing, and they will neither appreciate the gift, or neither the gift nor the giver of the gift.
Great quote. It's that inner freedom.
Exactly. It's, and I love that emphasis on the use of our freedom,
right,
is really the game that we're playing. And Zion isn't imposed through a forced program.
Yeah.
That's what it's almost like what the communists, or not communists, I'll say, it's the Marxists. The Marxists are trying to impose the good society through the systems of power.
Right.
And from the outside in, where Zion and what Christianity attempts to do is to transform people so that we will literally voluntarily do it on our own.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. And it's important to understand, what, that was a great quote that you read, because it talked about, this voluntary willingness to give. Again, that comes from inner freedom, but it also comes from a healthy relationship with our own belongings. There are and I make this very clear in the book, there are bad ways to live in capitalism. There are soul-destroying ways to live in capitalism. So what does it mean to live spiritually well in capitalism, right? Because you see quotes from Brigham Young and others, like really worried about the impact of money on the saints, right? And prosperity.
And that's a central theme of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
There's a warning against sort of tyranny, but there's also a warning against your excessive prosperity.
Yeah, right. And so Christianity, when it's well lived, you can live well in capitalism, in prosperity, if the center of your life is Christ, because you will have a different relationship to prosperity, to your belongings, when you have a life centered in Christ than if you don't have that, right? So when we read quotes by Brigham Young and other church leaders that talk about, like avoiding exploitative business practices and stuff like that, it doesn't mean that these are Marxists. Okay. Brigham Young was not a Marxist.
No.
But he was very, very clear about, you got to be careful with prosperity, right? It can destroy your soul if you're not careful.
Well, and it's funny, I'm a huge fan of Thomas Sowell, and and I think it was him or someone talking with him said, capitalism isn't actually a system. It's just leave people alone. Give them their economic freedom. Don't take people's stuff. Right. Well, what happens when we don't do, when you're free? Freedom, see, there's a problem, I think, in American culture to think that freedom from political sort of someone forcing you what to do, that's the end all. And it's like, no, that's the precondition necessary to make virtuous choices, because you can't make virtuous choices unless you're free. The goal is to make good choices.
Yeah.
And you in the book, I want to read a quote from the book that I absolutely loved because it was interesting. Here's a book on Marxism, but you also critique, I don't want to say you do critique capitalism, but it's more the poor use of your freedom in a capitalist society that lets you have all this abundance. And you said this, and you quoted one of my favorite people. You quoted G.K. Chesterton.
Oh, good.
You said this from the book. It says, quote, "The answer offered by capitalism is to empower people to purchase their way out of any form of alienation using money."
Yeah.
I thought that was exactly right, because people now in our society, they begin to see the economic prosperity as the goal. Yep. And they end up finding that that's a dead end road. And you quoted G.K. Chesterton, who said, "It cannot be too often repeated that what destroyed the family in the modern world was capitalism," or I would say abundance, prosperity.
Yeah.
No doubt it might have been communism if communism had ever had the chance outside of the semi-Mongolian wilderness where it actually flourishes. But so far as we are concerned, what has broken up household and encouraged divorces and treated the old domestic virtues with more and more open contempt is the epic power of capitalism. It is capitalism that has forced a moral feud and a commercial competition between the sexes. It has destroyed the influence of the parent in favor of the influence of the employer. It has driven men from their home to look for jobs, and it has forced them to live near their factories and their firms instead of near their families. And above all, it has encouraged, for commercial reasons, a parade of publicity and garish novelty, which is in its nature the death of all that was called dignity and modesty by our mothers and fathers.
Yeah.
What a profound statement. And it's sort of like, I don't like the capitalism versus communism dichotomy, because if you're turning capital into an ism, if you're turning money into the ideology that rules your life, wrong. I'll take it over communism.
Yeah.
I'll take it over the death camps, too much prosperity, but it will still lead you to a dead end.
Road. Oh yeah. Go walk around New York City and look around and see if that is a spiritually healthy place. It's incredibly wealthy, right? Incredibly prosperous. But go to LA, where I grew up, right? And look around and you'll see that capitalism has its challenges, and spiritually it has challenges. Prosperity brings challenges. So one of the best antidotes to Marxism is to live spiritually well in capitalism. Show that it can be done. And we're actually pretty good at doing it, as Latter-day Saints, probably because we pay tithing, we pay fast offerings. We're used to having these things that we do that give us a different relationship to our possessions.
So one of the great temptations I think that we face as Latter-day Saints is prosperity.
Yeah.
I think that one of the big problems, especially in somewhere like Utah, which has such a thriving economy, is the tech sector is moving there and all this stuff, is there is a lot of material prosperity. And that actually, I think you even quoted Brigham Young in the book that he was worried that we'd get big, fat, prosperous, and then we'd forget God and damn ourselves to hell or something
Right.
in that
Yeah.
wonderful Brigham Young style,
Yeah.
not pulling any punches. Because the answer is, well, and I think both sort of people that look towards capitalism, and I'm putting that in there as a sort of a worship of money and prosperity,
Yeah.
is what's weird is that the Marxist makes a good point. They're saying our salvation, our well-being, our ultimate thriving can actually be sucked out of us when you're working in some factory, or and the word they use is you're alienated from sort of your fullest potential, right? And so the vision, the Marxists sort of have this vision of salvation, right? And I guess the question I'll kind of ask to you is, what do you see as sort of the contrast between the Marxist sort of view of salvation versus maybe ours?
The Marxist view of salvation is godless, and ours is centered in God. That's really the reality of it. And I love what you just said, because the point of the book was, I want to imagine a scenario where let's imagine a scenario where somebody in mainland China who grew up indoctrinated in Marxism encounters the missionaries on a business trip, okay, and feels something and gets this curiosity, and that person shows up at your ward on Sunday, right? So, Jacob, this person shows up at your ward and wants to know more. Can you have that kind of a conversation with somebody who was indoctrinated in Marxism? The Like, I'm talking about the things that you just said, where you're actually trying to understand, okay, I see how people can understand or have the impression that Marxism is trying to do good. If you can start there and actually also understand, yeah, it's possible to experience real spiritual decline in capitalism, right? And you can actually bring, you can actually have a good conversation with somebody to the point where they won't feel threatened by the gospel, right? So that is something that's a big concern of my book, is the church is going to be going into places in the world where a lot of people are going to have to unlearn Marxism. So I wanted to kind of help people become equipped to have those conversations, as missionaries, as church members. I think you are equipped, obviously, from this conversation we've just had, but the point of the book was to help the church to develop this vocabulary and these new understandings.
And one of the things I loved most about it was how you approached it from a very, like, this isn't coming off at all in your book as a sort of, this is the great evil in the world. It does show the evil of it, but
Yeah,
it approaches it from like, I know you guys aren't meaning bad here.
right.
Your intentions, like, it's weird to say, because something that does such horrible evil, you think there can't be anything good or anything true in there. But at its roots, there are good and true things, and there were things that they were bringing up. But the problem is that they deviated from Christ into a godless sort of solution to the problems that ail man, rather than the solutions that actually work. Now,
Correct.
there's sort of this idea that a lot of people bring up. James Lindsay brings it up. I think he hits it right on. It's sort of this idea of Marxism as a religion. And a lot of people are like, well, it can't be a religion because they have these really narrow definitions. But I like to think about, regardless of what you call it, there are what I consider matters of ultimate concern. The fundamental questions of mankind Marxism and Marx himself proposed answers to those questions.
Yeah.
And anyone who's proposing answers to the big questions like the destiny of man, what makes man, what are we fundamentally, what is the highest potential that human beings can reach, that is going to be a religious, let's say, conversation.
Yes.
Okay. And so Marxism takes on, and people have pointed this out, a very religious flavor.
It
And
does.
there's sort of an idea of maybe a Marxist sort of covenant path.
Yeah.
What does that look like to you?
So Marxists have different covenants. They have new covenants, new covenants around activism, around atheism, around ritual, and all of those kinds of things. And so and that's why you can see when you have kids who graduate from college and they go on to grad school and then they get indoctrinated into Marxism, right? You can see just this shift in religion where all of a sudden, like, their former ways of understanding faith and righteousness and all of those things have been replaced, and it's hard to even have a conversation with them anymore because you're now talking with somebody who has a new religious framework. And there's a lot of people do not like to hear that, but I quoted Marxists in the book saying, yeah, this is religious. Eric Fromm, one of the most prominent members of the Frankfurt School for a time, he was very open about that. He said, Marxism is speaking to religious yearnings in people. That's what it's doing. He was very clear about that.
Yeah, and you do a great job in the book of pointing out this the metamorphosis. And if you want, let me actually pull this up. You had shared some slides, and in this, you had talked about, where is it? Let me go back one. There was a move away from sort of this economic Marxism. There was a recognition amongst the Marxists in the early 20th century that Marx was proposing theories related to economics as the application of Marxist ideas.
Yeah.
They then looked at it and said, wait a minute, this ideology doesn't just have to be applied to the economic sphere.
Right.
It can be put into others. Do you want to maybe comment on that a little bit?
Yeah. So Antonio Gramsci in Italy, he was a socialist activist and he pioneered what we call cultural Marxism. And where he said, okay, Marx prophesied, and he called Marx the master. It was like a religious title, right? And he understood that Marx had prophesied that, capitalism is going to collapse and then we'll have this ushering in of the new age of communism. And it didn't happen, right? So, but Gramsci saw that they were trying to do that in Russia. And there was this shift, this understanding that, okay, this doesn't happen without everybody buying into it, like having a change of mind and heart on a cultural level. You can't just impose this if people resist it culturally. He was saying, culture matters here. If you try to just impose this when people are culturally not accustomed to it, it'll never work. The Frankfurt School, which was an institute that was founded in Frankfurt, Germany in the early 20th century, they took that up as kind of their mission to create this thing they called critical theory, right? To speak to culture and speak to questions of psychology and other areas that are beyond economics, because they said, look, the economics that economic vision of Marx cannot come to fruition if all these other things are not addressed.
And so
Marxism.
So when people hear critical theory,
Yeah.
the idea is this is the application of this Marxist sort of worldview, the Marxist assumptions that you're applying to systems of power in various fields and critiquing them, breaking them down in order to create a more equitable outcome. And that's sort of would you say that's kind of a way of summing up that
that's exactly it.
What these people ended up going and doing?
Yeah. So the Frankfurt School was this just overtly Marxist enterprise of scholars and thinkers who came together and developed critical theory. They became the basis for what I call the fruits of Marxism, which are, your critical race theory, liberation theology, queer theory, decolonial theory, and these are kind of the new fruits, these various theoretical. And a lot of people who are in those fields, they have some distance from economic Marxism, so they're like, what, I'm a Marxist? Yeah, you actually are. This is Marxism, the whole from root to branch to fruit. It's Marxist.
And I've heard this analogy once given, because your average layperson who really loves Robin DiAngelo and is super into critical race theory, like, they would never say that they're a Marxist. But it's sort of like the way I heard it was, there's the theologians, there's the priests, and then there's the lay people at church.
Yeah.
Your average lay person in a Catholic church doesn't know anything about Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs for God.
Right.
They don't realize that their theology has been enormously influenced by St. Thomas Aquinas. They just go to church and they do the Catholic things.
Yeah.
Your average Marxist is just out doing the Marxist thing because that's what their priest, maybe the university professor that you had, who learned from the theologian.
Yeah.
So it's not a surprise that most people don't realize. Most people don't, in any ideological sort of worldview that a person has, a lot of people don't realize where the roots of that go. Your average, person who's a big believer in free market systems, like, they probably don't know much about Adam Smith or, conservatives with Edmund Burke or something like that. Like, they don't know the theologians that actually propagated the movements.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think it's just for anyone, like, whatever your ideological bent is, conservative, left wing, study where it came from.
Right.
Go find out who the theologians are. Understand why, like, where the roots of these worldviews are.
Yep.
And I think it will disturb some people to realize, oh, wait, this goes back to Marxist assumptions. And I think and I think that's what's so cool about your book, is that you are identifying the Marxist assumptions and comparing those with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because now we're down not to the application of Marxism in critical theory or in, critical race theory and queer theory or whatever. You're going to the very roots of it and saying, are your roots the same as our roots?
Right.
As Latter-day Saints.
Right. You have to do that. You absolutely have to. So that was the point of the book. I want people to be able to see just deep down, what are these root issues and how they emerged, actually, a lot of them just from the personal turmoil of Karl Marx himself, from abandoning Christianity and surrounding himself with Satanists, right? So,
and one more thing as we kind of wrap this up, just another opposition. There's a part where you talk about Satanism in relation to Marx. Now, there are people that are going to roll their eyes.
Of course.
Be like, oh boy, here we go. Right-wing conspiracy theorists. Marxism is satanic. But I think if they actually read what you say and the way you understand Satanism, do you want to give a little bit of a primer on that, just so people are a little bit aware of what is meant by that?
Yeah. So my whole chapter 9 of the book is on Marxism and Satanism. And I don't want people to hear that and freak out, like we're going to be talking about satanic rituals and weird stuff like that. That's not it at all. Modern Satanism is just about worship of the self. That's really what it is. Modern Satanists, when you ask them what they believe, it's about self-determination, self-autonomy, self-fulfillment. It's all about the self. So when Marx said the criticism of religion disillusions people so that they now revolve around themselves like the sun. You know, I'm paraphrasing, but that's a very close paraphrase to his quote that I quoted like 5 times in the book, because you have to understand what he was getting at. He wanted people to be self-obsessed, right? And so when you understand that essence of Satanism, what it really is just self-worship, then now you can kind of see, okay, you can see why Marx was inspired by some of these Satan admiring people, right?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because there are also people who are going to listen to this and they're going to think to themselves, no. The self is the center of capitalism. It's all about me and getting mine and being rich, being famous, all that kind of stuff. But what's funny is that they both put the self at the center, but they do it in different ways. Communism says your self is the product of the social forces around you. And therefore you need, in order for yourself to be okay, you have to go and be an activist and change the whole world. Otherwise you yourself are broken. The capitalist says, screw everybody else. Your prosperity, your fame, your being the big dog, that's the ultimate. And so it's a different kind of worship of the self. They're both are trying to get, it's all about you. And the Christian has Christ who says, he who will lose his life will find it.
Yeah.
Deny yourself and follow me.
Right.
It throws the entire, it isn't capitalism or communism. And you do a great job of that towards the end of the book. You talk about the difference between these sort of binary ideologies where we think it's this or that. You're either a capitalist or a Marxist. And it's like, no, we are Christians.
Yeah.
And
that's exactly it.
And that was really, it's, kind of that third way mentality. I'm going to read this quote again, because we often think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You bring him up in the book. He's one of the greatest heroes of all time to help sort of show everyone the horrible evils of communism and Marxism. But it was interesting because you provided his quotes critiquing capitalism.
Yeah.
And that was something that I was like, wait. You kind of think, well, again, there's this binary world. It's either capitalist or communist, right? Or capitalist or Marxist. It says this, you say in the book this, quote, in capitalist systems, markets are providing people with access to sexual sin, political corruption, gender surgeries, and countless other awful things that are bought with money. Living as faithful members of Christ's church in capitalist societies, we can take to heart President Benson's admonition, and President Benson being, the ultimate champion of anti-Marxism. And he says, and that means opposing evil ideologies, but also showing the world what it means to live spiritually well within a capitalist system. It means showing by the way we use our time and our resources that, in the words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the meaning of earthly existence lies not in prospering, but in the development of the soul.
Yeah.
And I love that.
That is my spiritual hero, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. There's nobody like him.
He's
really incredible.
Well, and he saw this. He saw not only that Marxism, see, a lot of people, they have the reactionary thing that, Marxism bad, capitalism good.
Right.
And it's like, and it can take you down to another false idol where the development of the soul and the use of our freedom. See, this is the big thing. I was asked to give a talk at a young men's camp, and it was actually on the American founding and kind of to help the boys to understand the importance of it. And I wanted to make it apolitical, and I wanted to focus on the essence of what the American founding was all about. And it was about making people free. But there was a recognition amongst the founders that we're not libertines. We're not saying be free, do whatever the freak you want with your freedom. It was, we're going to make you free because we trust that you'll choose virtue. And that you can't have the good society without liberty. but you can't have the good society with free people that just do whatever the freak they want.
Right.
You have to get people to freely choose to do the right thing and not to use their resources and time, as you say in the book, towards the ends that bring their own debasement of their soul and the debasement of their society. And so the idea is make people free. And the title of my talk was this to the young men was, what will you do with your freedom? What will you do with it? That's the question. You're free. But if you use it right, that freedom will expand and grow and be beautiful and wonderful. That's how you get to the vision of the ideal world.
Yeah. So that is the heart of Alexander Solzhenitsyn right there. You know, what do you do with your freedom? You can do really bad things with it, or you can do wonderful things with it. What do you do with your prosperity? That is the message of Solzhenitsyn. I dedicated the book to him. I just love his mind and heart. I think he was a great soul.
Awesome. Well, I'll give you the final word. Any final thoughts on this?
No, I hope those of you who get the book, I hope you find it valuable. You know, reach out, and if you have any questions or anything, or just, you know, ask as comments on this video. I'd love to interact with you.
Awesome. And everyone, just so you know, I will be putting a link to the book in the video description. Where can they get the book, if not from the link in the video description?
It's just go to Amazon.
Perfect. And you do have it on Kindle, which I very much appreciated.
I do. I love Kindle.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Dan. I really appreciate you coming on.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button so my future videos show up on your feed. Also, if you or someone that you know has benefited from the content here on Thoughtful Faith, please consider becoming a channel donor or volunteer by visiting my new website, thoughtfulfaith.org, and clicking on the Get Involved page.